Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, March 4th, 2024. Thank you so much for joining me. A reminder, I've shifted up the way I'm doing these videos since the start of the new year. So the first video of each month will be a little bit longer video, a little bit more conversational, but also allow us to go into a little bit more technical detail about the philosophical topics. Then the other videos, once a week, will be a little bit less long, less substantive, and more practical, more engaged with our everyday lives and trying to put philosophy into practice on the trails. So I hope this new format is something that really vibes with you. I've been getting mixed signals from folks. On the one hand, I'm hearing people say, oh, we want you to do much more long, technical, very difficult content. And others telling me, dude, stop talking about ontology and all of the big fancy hermeneutic words and instead just make it about a kind of inspiration for living. So hopefully this is a balance. Beginning of the month, do a little bit more substantive. The rest of the month, a little bit more practical. A few days ago, I had the great opportunity to work with my son and his two friends, Liam and Parks. They all go to a middle school here in town, and they were on a job shadow day, which means they get to go wherever they want and work with people, learn how different jobs look, different career opportunities, and think about what might suit them as they move forward into high school, college, and beyond. Well, they actually wanted to do philosophy. So first, I'm already stoked because that's not exactly like the sexy thing to do at the universities. In fact, last year, my son worked with a neuroscientist and got to hold human brains. He worked with a biologist who's doing all kinds of cool stuff on bird calls in wetlands. And then this year, before meeting with me, he also met with another scientist to learn about insects and a particular way that insects can tell us important things regarding species loss in all kinds of global contexts. But then the real fun started and he got to hang out with his dad and do some philosophy. So Liam and Parks and Atticus all got together with me, and I decided rather than letting them come to like one of my philosophy classes, which would be, I think, less compelling, I would do philosophy at their level, engaging them about the questions that really mattered to them. And so what I thought I'd do today is think with you about the very things that they raised as things worth thinking about. So although it's a little bit more substantive, it's also grounded in this really cool thing about philosophy that the most difficult questions are not ones that take 25 years and a PhD in order to think about. They are the things that 14-year-olds are already asking, already wrestling with. For what it's worth, I actually started college as a physics major. And part of why I shifted away from physics to philosophy, which took a little bit of doing, became a history major, then went to humanities and intellectual history, and then landed in philosophy. But that transition ultimately was because I loved the questions of physics. What's the nature of reality, the nature of time, the nature of identity? But I didn't like the fact that it was just math for like 20 years before I got to really wrestle with those big theoretical issues. In philosophy, day one of Intro to Philosophy is already what is justice? Is there a God? What is the good life? What's the purpose for living? And why is there something rather than nothing? In other words, we don't have to wait to ask the big questions. Instead, we ask the big questions, and then what it looks like to get trained to become a professional at this is to just go deeper and deeper in the various ways to understand the question and the historical responses that have been offered. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that fact really compelling. Now, another thing, though, we could say about philosophy, as I tried to explain to this room of middle schoolers, is philosophy is never actually abstract. Part of why we get to ask these big theoretical questions from the outset is because what it looks like to think well for philosophers is always also to be interested in what it means to live on purpose, to live meaningfully, to seek the good in our daily lives. So I met with them, and what we did is talked about some very basic questions that really opened on to some amazing conversations. And I want to kind of think through some of those with you. The first question that I started with is simply a question having to do with the basics of ontology and subjectivity. It's the question, who am I? So I asked the middle schoolers, who are you? And as a way of trying to get them to think about how to maybe interrogate their responses, what we did is this very cool exercise called the 6-word memoir. What this is you get 6 words, not 5, not 7, 6 words to tell the story of your life, to introduce yourself to someone in a way that basically allows your memoir, your narrative, to be expressed with this limit of 6 words. The answers I got from this 12-year-old and 2 14-year-olds were fantastic. And they gave me a variety of different things. One person gave me answers that were basically linked to different attributes that they hoped characterized their lives: kind, charitable, gracious, courageous. Another person talked about the different interests that defined his existence, right? Basketball and enjoying particular types of outdoor activities. And yet the third asked a kind of question, but said it as a declarative sentence: I don't know what to expect. Now, that's an amazing answer from a 14-year-old. But what's especially cool, and I explain this to them, is that far too often as we age, we move from a kind of expectation to this sense that we now have enough and that we're good, and we don't have really any forward-looking anticipation for how to make sense of our lives. Our story has already been told. And I explained to them that when I give talks about camping with Kierkegaard, my new book, I get older people coming up to me and saying, thank you for allowing me to recover and restore the sense of expectation that can define my existence. Rather than being retired and therefore not now living in expectation, I realize that the ultimate task of existence is to be expectant about who we are hoping to become. So I explained to the middle schoolers, you all are not only age appropriate with not knowing what to expect because it all hasn't happened yet, but you're already tapping into a really powerful existential depth that often adults tend to forget, right? We become so obsessed with the particulars and the details of living that we really get overwhelmed with logistics and forget to enjoy allowing ourselves to imagine possibilities. And this opened then from this question of kind of who are you ontological issues onto a broader question about how philosophy can help us be invested in becoming the kind of self we hope to be. So I explained to them that my preferred definition of philosophy is that philosophers put question marks where everyone else puts periods. And so I taught them an exercise, a way of thinking about how to do this. And I said, look, there's this really cool thing in the English language where we can upspeak at the end of our sentences to indicate a question. So we can take a declarative sentence, there are 5 birds sitting on the fence, and turn it into a question. There are 5 birds sitting on the fence? And so what I had them do was think about the things that they take for granted, that they consider obvious about their own lives, about their social contexts, about things that matter. And then ask them to turn those sentences with a little upspeak into questions. And we talked about, what is this likely to yield in your social group, at lunch tables, while going to practice? And they all, without skipping a beat, said, it's gonna get you made fun of. And so I told them the story of Socrates, who, as a gadfly, he said, he was stinging the society's tail and trying to remind it not to become complacent, to care about truth more than just their status, to care about the good rather than simply what benefited them. But Socrates, as many of you probably know, I explained to them, ended up getting sentenced to death for being a corrupting influence on his society because the power structure doesn't want questions to be normal. So I, of course, talked about this in the context of their parents and the fact that parents want to reaffirm the way that their views get appropriated by their kids. Now, the irony was not lost on my son, who of course was rolling his eyes at me as I explained this general Foucaultian conception of power dynamics operative in our social lives that constitute our identities and our narratives of those identities. But it was a really cool moment because they saw immediately the way this plays out. And in fact, the 12-year-old Parks said, This is kind of like bullies, right? That bullies need to be powerful, so they need you to agree with them. They need you to affirm them. They don't like being questioned. And I said, yes, exactly. Now you understand not only ontology, not only philosophical method and practice, but we're opening now onto social and political theory as relates to power dynamics. So from there, I asked them, so how then should we go about living in the world given our commitment to asking questions in ways that represent the importance of contingency, of possibility, of an open world rather than a closed power structure? And they immediately said, yes, let's talk about how then to make choices. In other words, they wanted to talk about ethics. So I asked them, well, how is it that you guys decide what's right? And I got a range of answers. Some said, well, the way that we think about what's right is whatever just feels right. Intuitionism, right? A moral intuition, a moral sentimentalism. Others said, well, because it brings about good things. And so what's right is that it's helping people. And I said, yes, well, we've got a consequentialism. And somebody said, well, it's just because it's the right thing to do. Well, right. Now we're on deontological ethics. So we went through the general three frames, the three categories of classical moral theory. And that's where we kind of ended the hour and a half conversation. And so I'll go through these with you as well. In ethics, there are three big clumps of moral perspectives. And there's a lot of variation, but these three become the kind of big headings under which all of the nuance then plays out. The first option is to think about ethics, or think about what's the right thing to do in the context of realizing that the moral value of an act lies in the intention behind that act. So here we might talk about the idea that it doesn't matter what happens, what matters is what you intended. Did you do it because it's the right thing to do? Was your intention simply to do right? Here we kind of hit on a Maya Angelou claim where she says that her grandma used to say, now, honey, you know what's right, just do right. And that move is, in fact, the basic intuition of this intention ethics. Now, the technical phrase for this is deontological ethics because it's rooted in the notion of duty. Do we do our duty to do what's right? This, of course, is articulated most famously by Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher who was notorious for being very rigidly on time. And Immanuel Kant's claim was basically, we don't get to pick and choose in situations what's right. What's right is the case, and it dictates how to navigate our situations. So you don't get to cut in line if your friends are at the front and the movie's getting ready to start, because cutting in line violates the principle that he puts forth as the guide for moral action. In other words, how do we know what our duty is? And Kant says, we ask the following question. He calls this the categorical imperative. And he says, can you will that the thing you're doing be done by everybody without a contradiction? So think about cutting in line. If I want to cut in line because I'm running really late, my friends are at the front, I'm holding up other people, well, if I cut in line, then I'm willing that everybody gets to cut in line. But if everybody cuts in line, the very concept of a line doesn't work. So it is immoral for me to cut in line because it's violating my duty to do only that which I could will for everyone. Same thing about telling lies. Right? If I say, well, but it's a lie for a good reason, it's helping people, it makes them feel better about themselves. Kant says, no matter the outcome, lying means you would will that everyone lies. But if everyone lies in those circumstances, that means that the truth won't have any traction. Truth requires the assumption that lying is problematic. So we don't get to lie, we don't get to cheat, we don't get to cut in line, we don't get to be unfaithful just because it's trying to spare someone's feelings, or it yields me having better social relationships with the cool kids who are already in the front of the line. Consequences do not matter for deontological moral concerns. However, as my son pointed out in our conversation, but Dad, this sounds good, but what if you're trying to do what's right, but it leads to people getting hurt? And it's a good objection, man. When we think about moral life, it seems like we need to think about what happens, or at least what is likely to happen. The outcome that we hope to bring about is one where people are benefited, they are made better. And this is the basic view called consequentialism, where we're not looking at intention, we're looking at outcomes and consequences. The great examples of this are in the utilitarian camp, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Whereas Kant says we should only think about what reason demands, what we can will for everybody, Mill and Bentham suggest that we should engage in a kind of calculus whereby we try to figure out who will be benefited and who will be harmed relative to a specific action. And the goal is to maximize that benefit and minimize that harm. Now, you might see that there are some circumstances where deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics are likely to overlap. When it comes to lying, say, telling the truth often is what brings about the most pleasure and minimizes the most displeasure among a community, because societies fail when people engage in lying, or what Harry Frankfurt will then make even more a concern, bullshit. If we are liars, if we are bullshitters, the problem is we have failed to take seriously the relationships to others that are the fabric of a flourishing society. So notice, there are moments where these different moral theories can overlap, but the fundamental difference is there is nothing wrong about lying as such for the consequentialist. It is wrong because of what it's likely to do to the greatest good in our community. That's a big difference. Is something wrong because it's wrong and something right because it's right, or is it right or wrong because of what it's likely to yield? Well, I explained to the kids that this is tough, right? These are really hard issues and very smart people disagree. But then I gave them a third option, which is one I particularly find very compelling, and this is the virtue ethics articulated by Aristotle, where we stop thinking about morality as a matter of an act that bears moral weight, and we instead think about lives that are rightly described as virtuous. Instead of the right will, Kant, deontology, the right outcomes, Mill, utilitarianism, we're now focused on developing the right character. And what it looks like to develop right character is we do, as a habit, what good people do. We make virtue a normal thing for us in our lives because it's something that we've put the time and effort into making habitual. Our habits determine our identity, says Aristotle. And so if we make being courageous a habit, then it becomes part of what it means to say that that person shows courage. If we make honesty a virtue in our character, it's not that I have to think through what are the outcomes, what are the costs of this lie. I don't lie because I'm a truthful person. Honesty defines my selfhood. So for Aristotle, he shifts the location at which the moral question occurs. It's not about the action, it's about the person. Now, I then asked the three of them, in light of these three different options, all of which are very different, though again, they might overlap in many cases, the reasons that they're justifying their view are really very importantly distinct. I asked them, so which one do you land on? Where do you stand? And all three very impressively said, well, it seems like it depends on the circumstances. There are times where, yeah, this is right, but we could see a case where it would make that right thing deeply wrong to do. It would yield such bad outcomes that it overrides the moral worth of the action. And I said, right, this is what's called moral pluralism. Moral pluralism is not, hey, pick whatever you want. Moral pluralism says that moral theories are not absolute zero-sum games. They, in fact, all work together in order to make us understand that a virtuous character is actually what is likely to yield doing what's right because it's also our duty. And understanding our duties seems to require that we also think about the likely outcomes and the harm or help that our actions yield. So it's not that we've got to pick absolutely one or the other. You can. A lot of smart philosophers do. But we landed at a kind of moral pluralism where thinking really intentionally is the goal. doing philosophy is actually the best moral strategy. And then deploying different moral theories to underwrite the contingent, difficult, complicated, and ambiguous decisions we end up making is the best we can hope for. And this idea, I want to make sure you don't misunderstand me, is not that, hey, because the good's just a crapshoot. The point was to get them to understand that there is always risk involved in existing, that we aren't guaranteed that our decisions will always work out the way we hope. But instead, if we are living reflectively, living philosophically, living purposefully, what I describe in Camping with Kierkegaard as living faithfully, we are likely to do the best we can with what we've got to work with, given what's been made of us to that point. That kind of appreciation of risk actually, I think, deepens the stakes of living well. And ultimately, I think it shows the radical practical use of philosophy in all of our lives. So this week, think about this conversation I had with these 3 middle schoolers who modeled for me what it looks like to do philosophy well without any training in philosophical history, philosophical technical literature. They didn't know the vocabulary, but they understand the questions because they are already invested in thinking well in order to live well. May we do the same. I wish you well. Hope you have an amazing week. Make sure to like and subscribe the YouTube videos. Drop a comment. Would love to hear from you. And while you're at it, hop on over to jrnsimmons.com. Check out all the extra content there on my website and go to my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild. I post a variety of things, at least 2 essays a week, and I would love to have you join me and think with me there as we hit the trails of life together. Thank you again so much. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.